The Dutch East India Company, or VOC, officially ended in 1799. But you know, its story did not end there. The VOC was more than just a company. It was, well, a state within a state. It had its own army, its own laws, and it ruled over vast territories. When it collapsed, its shadow remained, stretching long over the islands of what would become Indonesia. This legacy was not just about trade routes or profits. It was about power, control, and the deep, lasting changes it forced upon millions of people. The VOC's influence shaped societies, created new social structures, and left behind a blueprint for colonial rule that the Dutch government would follow and perfect for another century and a half. Understanding the VOC is crucial to understanding modern Indonesia. The company's methods of control were brutal and efficient. They were not interested in the well-being of the local populations. Their only goal was to extract as much wealth as possible. This single-minded pursuit of profit led to systems of forced labor, monopoly, and political manipulation. These systems did not disappear with the company. Instead, they were absorbed by the new colonial state. The VOC's ghost continued to walk the halls of power, guiding the policies of its successor. Its impact is still visible today in the economic disparities, political structures, and even the cultural fabric of the nation. The story of the VOC's afterlife is a tale of continuity. When the Dutch government took over the company's debts and assets, it also inherited its mindset. The idea that the colonies existed solely for the benefit of the motherland was a core principle of the VOC. This principle became the foundation of Dutch colonial policy. The methods might have changed slightly, and the administration became more centralized, but the fundamental relationship of exploitation remained the same. The people of the archipelago were not seen as subjects to be governed, but as resources to be managed for maximum economic output. This perspective had devastating consequences that would echo through generations. So, while the history books mark 1799 as the end of the VOC, it was really just a transition. It was the moment a private enterprise of exploitation became a state-run enterprise of exploitation. The company's collapse was not a liberation for the people it ruled. It was simply the beginning of a new chapter in a long story of foreign domination. The VOC laid the groundwork, drew the maps, and established the systems of control. The Dutch state then built its colonial empire upon those very foundations, ensuring that the company's powerful and exploitative legacy would endure for many more years, casting a long and dark shadow over the future. The Dutch East India Company was once the richest corporation in history. It seemed invincible. But by the late 18th century, this mighty giant was crumbling from within. The primary cause was corruption. The company's officials, known as dienaren, were paid very little. To make up for this, they engaged in widespread private and illegal trade. They used the company's ships and resources for their own personal gain. This practice became so common that it was said the VOC perished on corruption. The wealth that should have flowed into the company's coffers in Amsterdam was instead lining the pockets of its employees in Asia. This systemic rot weakened the company from the inside out. At the same time, the VOC was drowning in debt. It had borrowed enormous sums of money to finance its wars and maintain its vast network of forts and trading posts. The company was constantly at war, fighting to establish and protect its monopolies. It fought against local rulers, European rivals like the British and Portuguese, and even pirates. These military campaigns were incredibly expensive. They required a standing army and a large navy. While these forces were necessary to enforce the company's will, they drained its finances. The cost of maintaining its power eventually became greater than the profits it could generate from its trade monopolies. The Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, from 1780 to 1784, was the final blow. The British Royal Navy was far superior to the VOC's fleet. It devastated Dutch shipping, capturing valuable cargo and disrupting the company's vital trade routes. The war effectively cut off the connection between the VOC's operations in Asia and its headquarters in Europe. Without the constant flow of goods and money, the company could no longer sustain itself. Its shares plummeted in value, and its credit disappeared. The once powerful VOC was now bankrupt and powerless, a hollow shell of its former self. It was a stunning fall from grace for the world's first multinational corporation. Finally, in 1799, the Dutch government, then known as the Batavian Republic, stepped in. It could no longer ignore the company's massive failure. The government officially dissolved the VOC and took control of all its debts and territorial possessions. This included the vast archipelago that the company had dominated for 2 centuries. The era of corporate colonialism was over, but the era of state colonialism was just beginning. The Dutch state inherited a ready-made empire, complete with the administrative tools and exploitative systems the VOC had so carefully constructed. The giant had fallen, but its legacy was about to be given a new and even more powerful life.
When the Dutch government took over, it did not dismantle the VOC's systems. It refined them. One of the most lasting impacts was the creation of a rigid social hierarchy. The Dutch placed themselves at the very top. They were the rulers, the administrators, and the business owners. Below them were other Europeans and Eurasians. A separate category was created for foreign Orientals, which included Chinese, Arab, and Indian communities. These groups were often used as middlemen in trade and tax collection, creating a buffer between the Dutch and the indigenous population. At the very bottom of this pyramid were the natives, the vast majority of the Indonesian people. This racial and social stratification was legally enforced and became a defining feature of colonial life. This new social order was a deliberate strategy of divide and rule. By creating distinct classes with different rights and privileges, the Dutch prevented the diverse peoples of the archipelago from uniting against them. The Chinese, for example, were given economic roles that often put them in conflict with the local Javanese population. This created resentment and suspicion between different groups, making it easier for the Dutch to maintain control. The traditional Indonesian aristocracy was also co-opted into this system. Local rulers, or bupatis, were allowed to keep their titles and some of their authority, but only if they served the colonial administration. They became the enforcers of Dutch policies, further dividing them from their own people. The Dutch also imposed Western laws and administrative structures. Before their arrival, the archipelago was a mosaic of kingdoms and villages, each with its own adat, or customary law. The Dutch replaced this with a unified legal system that served their own interests. This new system protected European property rights and commercial contracts, but it often ignored local traditions and justice. The VOC had already started this process by creating its own courts and regulations in the territories it controlled. The colonial states simply expanded this, creating a centralized bureaucracy that reached deep into village life. This bureaucracy was designed for one purpose: efficient extraction of resources. The most direct form of control was the continuation and expansion of forced cultivation. The VOC had pioneered this system, compelling farmers to grow specific cash crops like coffee, sugar, and indigo instead of food for themselves. The Dutch government took this idea and turned it into a massive state-run enterprise. This shift from subsistence farming to export-oriented agriculture had a profound and devastating impact on rural society. It locked millions of people into a cycle of forced labor, took away their economic independence, and fundamentally changed their relationship with their land. The social and legal divisions created by the Dutch were the framework that made this large-scale exploitation possible. In 1830, the Dutch colonial government introduced a new policy called the cultuurstelsel, or the cultivation system. This was essentially the VOC's model of forced cultivation, but on a much larger and more systematic scale. The theory was simple. Instead of paying land taxes in cash, Javanese villagers had to devote 1/5 of their land to growing government-chosen export crops. These crops included coffee, sugar, indigo, and tea. The produce was then handed over to the government at a fixed low price. The Dutch then sold these goods on the world market for huge profits. This system turned the entire island of Java into a massive state-owned plantation. In reality, the system was far more brutal than the theory suggested. The 1/5 rule was often ignored. Colonial officials and their local Indonesian allies, the Bupatis, forced farmers to use their best and most fertile lands for cash crops. Often, much more than 1/5 of the land was taken. The labor required to cultivate these crops was also immense. Farmers had to spend a significant portion of their year working on government fields, neglecting their own rice paddies. The system was enforced by Dutch controllers and the co-opted Javanese elite, whose salaries and bonuses depended on meeting high production quotas. This created a powerful incentive for them to squeeze the villagers as hard as possible. The economic consequences for the Javanese people were catastrophic. As more and more land and labor were diverted to export crops, the production of rice, their staple food, declined sharply. This led to widespread food shortages and devastating famines. In the 1840s, regions like Cirebon and Demak suffered mass starvation, directly linked to the demands of the cultivation system. While the Dutch treasury in the Netherlands grew rich, filling its coffers with profits from Javanese labor, the people who produced this wealth were pushed deeper into poverty. The system destroyed local economies and made villagers completely dependent on the colonial state. The cultivation system was the VOC's legacy writ large. It took the company's exploitative practices and transformed them into a highly organized, state-sanctioned machine of extraction. It demonstrated the continuity of colonial policy, where the goal remained the same: to enrich the Netherlands at the expense of the Indonesian people. The system was eventually dismantled in the late 19th century due to growing criticism in the Netherlands about its inhumanity. However, the economic structures it created remained. The focus on export agriculture and the integration of the Indonesian economy into the global capitalist system on deeply unequal terms would continue to shape the country's destiny long after the last coffee plant was harvested under forced labor. The Dutch colonial enterprise, built on the foundations of the VOC, had a dual legacy. On one side was immense profit for the Netherlands. On the other was profound poverty for Indonesia. The wealth extracted from the archipelago, first by the VOC and then by the state, was honestly staggering. The profits from the cultivation system, for example, helped the Netherlands pay off its national debt, fund massive industrial projects like the national railway system, and build beautiful cities. The Dutch Golden Age may have started earlier, but its later prosperity was really financed by the sweat and suffering of the Indonesian people. The riches of the colonies flowed directly into the Dutch economy, creating a stark contrast between the wealth of the colonizer and the poverty of the colonized. For the vast majority of Indonesians, the colonial period was a time of economic decline and hardship. The systems of forced labor and land use destroyed self-sufficient local economies. Farmers who once grew food for their families and communities were now forced to produce crops for a distant global market. They lost control over their land and their labor. This dependency created a cycle of poverty that was, honestly, pretty difficult to escape. Any small profits they might have made were often eaten up by taxes, and the need to buy food they could no longer grow. This systematic impoverishment was not an accidental byproduct of colonialism. It was actually a necessary condition for its success. The system was designed to keep labor cheap and resources flowing out. The focus on cash crops also made the population vulnerable to global market fluctuations. When the price of sugar or coffee dropped in Europe, the impact was felt directly in the villages of Java. Yet, the farmers had no say in the matter. Their economic fate was decided in Amsterdam and Rotterdam. This created a fragile and unstable economy at the local level. Furthermore, the infrastructure that the Dutch did build, such as roads, railways and ports, was not designed to benefit the local population. It was built to transport goods from the plantations and mines to the coast, so they could be shipped to Europe more efficiently. It was, in essence, an infrastructure of extraction, not of development. This legacy of economic exploitation is, well, long and deep. The colonial economy was structured to prevent the growth of a strong, independent Indonesian business class. It created an economy dependent on the export of raw materials, a pattern that still persists in many post-colonial nations today. The poverty and economic inequality that characterized the colonial era did not simply vanish with independence. The new Indonesian nation inherited an economic structure that had been designed for centuries to serve foreign interests. Overcoming this legacy and building a more equitable and self-sufficient economy has been one of the central challenges for Indonesia since it gained its freedom.
While the Dutch colonial system was primarily designed for exploitation, it inadvertently planted the seeds of its own destruction. To run their vast colonial enterprise, the Dutch needed a class of low-level administrators, clerks, and technicians. It was just too expensive to bring all these workers from Europe. So, the solution was to provide a limited, Western-style education to a small number of select Indonesians. These were often the children of the priayi, the traditional Javanese aristocracy that collaborated with the colonial government. The goal here wasn't to enlighten them, but to create a loyal and capable native workforce. This new educated class was taught in Dutch schools. They learned the Dutch language, European history, and Western ideas about science, law, and politics. They were, trained to think and work within the colonial system. For the first time, young people from different parts of the archipelago, from Java, Sumatra, and the outer islands, were brought together in the same classrooms. They began to see themselves not just as Javanese or Batak, but as part of a shared experience. This education gave them the tools to understand the colonial system from the inside. It also exposed them to revolutionary Western concepts that were not part of their curriculum. Ideas like liberty, equality, and nationalism. The Dutch hoped this education would create obedient subjects. Instead, it created critical thinkers. The educated elite began to see the glaring hypocrisy of colonial rule. They were taught about the French Revolution and the ideals of freedom and self-determination. Yet they lived in a society where they were treated as second-class citizens. They read about democracy and human rights in Dutch books, but they saw oppression and racial discrimination all around them. This contradiction between the ideals they learned and the reality they experienced created a powerful sense of frustration and injustice. It became the intellectual fuel for a new kind of resistance. This small group of Western-educated Indonesians would become the pioneers of the nationalist movement. They used the language and intellectual frameworks of their colonizers to argue against colonialism itself. They started study clubs, published newspapers, and formed political organizations. They began to imagine a new future, a future where the diverse peoples of the archipelago would be united in a single, independent nation. The Dutch had intended to create clerks and functionaries. By a great historical irony, they had instead educated the very leaders who would one day rise up and dismantle their empire. The schools meant to uphold the colonial order became the nurseries of revolution. The administrative state, built by the Dutch, continuing the VOC's work, played a crucial role in fostering a sense of national identity. For the first time, the vast and diverse archipelago was united under a single political and economic system. People from different islands and ethnic groups were governed by the same laws, paid taxes to the same authority, and were part of the same economic structure. The railways and steamships that the Dutch built to transport goods also transported people and ideas. A student from Sumatra could travel to Java to study, and a trader from Sulawesi could work in Borneo. This new mobility and shared experience of being ruled by the Dutch helped to break down old regional loyalties. This shared experience was, for the most part, a shared experience of suffering. The economic exploitation and racial discrimination of the colonial system created a common grievance. Whether you were a farmer in Java forced to grow sugar, a miner in Sumatra digging for tin, or a clerk in Batavia facing a glass ceiling, you were part of a system that placed you at the bottom. This shared sense of being oppressed became a powerful unifying force. The Western-educated elite began to articulate this feeling, giving it a political voice. They argued that the people of the Indies had a common enemy, the Dutch colonial regime, and a common destiny: freedom. The early 20th century saw the birth of modern Indonesian nationalism. Organizations like Budi Utomo, founded in 1908, initially focused on cultural and educational advancement for the Javanese. But soon, more overtly political groups emerged. The Sarekat Islam grew into a mass movement with millions of members, channeling popular discontent against colonial policies. The Indonesian National Party, founded in 1927 by a young engineer named Sukarno, explicitly called for independence. These groups used the tools of modern politics, newspapers, rallies, and congresses to spread their message and build a national consciousness. A pivotal moment came in 1928 with the Youth Pledge. Young nationalist leaders from across the archipelago came together and made a famous declaration. They pledged to have one motherland, Indonesia, one nation, the Indonesian nation, and one language of unity, the Indonesian language. This was a radical act of imagination. It was the moment when the idea of Indonesia, a nation that did not yet exist on any map, was born. The seeds planted by the shared experience of colonial rule, both the administrative unity and the collective suffering, had finally sprouted into a full-blown movement for independence. The VOC's shadow had created the very conditions for a unified nation to emerge from its grip. The VOC may have disappeared over 2 centuries ago, but its business model remains surprisingly relevant. The VOC was the world's first publicly traded multinational corporation. It was a joint stock company, meaning people could buy shares in it, spreading the financial risk and allowing it to raise huge amounts of capital. This structure is the foundation of almost every major corporation in the world today. The VOC demonstrated how to mobilize private wealth for global enterprise on an unprecedented scale. Modern companies like Apple or Amazon, with their global supply chains and massive market capitalization, are the direct descendants of the corporate structure pioneered by the Dutch in 1602. But the parallels go deeper than just corporate finance. The VOC wielded power that went far beyond business. It had the authority to wage war, sign treaties, mint its own coins, and establish colonies. It operated with a level of autonomy that is almost unthinkable for a company today. However, some modern multinational corporations exert a similar kind of influence, albeit more subtly. They can influence government policy through lobbying, shape international trade rules, and impact the economies of entire nations. When a company's annual revenue is larger than the GDP of many countries, its decisions about where to invest or build factories can have profound political and social consequences, echoing the state-like power of the VOC. The VOC also had a dark side that finds echoes in the modern world: the exploitation of labor and resources in poorer parts of the globe. The company's quest for profit led it to use forced labor, destroy local economies, and engage in extreme violence to protect its monopolies. Today, while the methods are less overt, concerns remain about the practices of some multinational corporations. Issues like sweatshop labor in the garment industry, environmental destruction from mining or palm oil plantations, and the use of complex legal structures to avoid taxes all raise questions about corporate responsibility. The tension between the drive for profit and ethical conduct is a theme that runs from the VOC to the boardrooms of the 21st century. Furthermore, the VOC's story is a cautionary tale about the impact of corporate power on society. The company was not just a trader, it was a ruler. It fundamentally reshaped the societies it encountered for its own benefit.
creating social divisions and economic dependencies that lasted for centuries. This serves as a powerful reminder that the activities of large global corporations are never just about business. They have a deep and lasting impact on culture, politics, and the environment. The legacy of the VOC prompts us to look critically at the role of corporations in our world today and to ask who truly benefits from their global reach and immense power.
The legacy of the Dutch East India Company in Indonesia is a complex tapestry of creation and destruction. It was a force of brutal exploitation that caused immense suffering, entrenched poverty, and established a system of racial hierarchy. Its methods of forced cultivation and trade monopolies shattered traditional economies and societies. This dark legacy of oppression was continued and amplified by the Dutch colonial state, leaving deep scars on the Indonesian psyche and its economic structure. The poverty and inequality that began in the VOC era were not easily erased and remain a challenge for the nation to this day. It stands as a stark reminder of how the pursuit of profit without morality can lead to human catastrophe. Yet, paradoxically, the VOC and its successor also laid the groundwork for the modern Indonesian state. The administrative boundaries drawn by the Dutch, the infrastructure they built for their own purposes, and the centralized government they imposed all helped to unify a diverse archipelago. The Western education they offered to a select few, intended to create compliant clerks, instead produced revolutionary leaders armed with the ideas of nationalism and self-determination. The shared experience of being ruled and exploited by a foreign power forged a common identity among people who had previously seen themselves as separate. In this sense, Indonesia as a nation was born in the crucible of colonialism. Reflecting on the VOC's story is not just a historical exercise, it offers crucial lessons for our contemporary globalized world. The VOC was the prototype for the multinational corporation, a private entity with global reach and immense power. Its history forces us to consider the responsibilities that come with such power. It highlights the persistent danger of economic exploitation, the potential for corporate interests to override human rights, and the long-term consequences of prioritizing profit above all else. The story of the VOC and its aftermath in Indonesia is a powerful case study in the dynamics of power, wealth, and inequality on a global scale. Ultimately, the VOC's shadow teaches us that history is never truly in the past. Its influence is woven into the fabric of the present, in the economic relationships between nations, in the structures of global corporations, and in the enduring quest for justice and equality in post-colonial societies. For Indonesia, understanding this legacy is a vital part of understanding itself. For the rest of the world, it is a cautionary tale written in history's ledger, a warning that the actions of the powerful, whether a 17th century trading company or a 21st century corporation, have consequences that will echo for generations to come. The story matters because it is in many ways still our story.